One of the more important elements that you need on your layout, especially if you're doing formal operations, is signage. Even if you don't do formal operations, signs help the people viewing your layout to understand what those industries are, what they're supposed to be doing, and why they exist on your layout. But many modelers skimp on their signage. The thinking seems to be, fire up the word processor, type in some letters using the base settings, and click print. And that's a shame because it can really detract from the perceived quality of your models. The good news is, with the addition of a couple of quick and easy steps, your signs can be so much more. Hi everybody, I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot. Today we're going to talk about 6 ways to improve signage on your layout. With today's technology, it is very easy to create signs and add them to your layout. Signs provide an identity for the building and/or industry, and unique signage sets one industry apart from another. And yet I see layouts where the industries either have no signs at all, or more commonly, every building has a sign that uses plain old Arial or Times New Roman font. I get it. Not everyone is a graphic designer, and not everyone is great with technology. Here's a secret. You don't need to be. What I'm going to talk about here are simple things that you can do to jazz up your signage, even if you think plaid and polka dots go together. And best of all, these tips can be put into play using the exact same word processor that you'd use to print those basic signs. Full disclosure, I am not formally trained in graphic design. I have an interest in fonts and graphics, and I've picked up a lot of things along the way. I do try to understand why some things work and why others don't, but it is not something I went to school for. This has not stopped me from designing lots of logos and signs along the way, and you shouldn't let it stop you either. Today we're going to use some made-up examples as well as photos from real businesses that I took in an industrial park near my house. I suggest doing this yourself just so that you can get ideas. I do not suggest trespassing on private property to get your photos. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get moving. Number 0. Add signs to the layout. As you can probably tell by the numbering, this first one really isn't part of the list, since you can't have better signs if you don't have any at all. Do yourself a favor and make signs for your layout. Even if you ignore every other suggestion I make in this video, why would you do that? Even if you ignore every other suggestion I make in this video, the simple addition of signs on buildings and industries will improve your layout immensely. Signs will make the layout more interesting, as well as easier for visitors to understand, make it easier for operators to know where they've been and where they're supposed to go, and keep yourself a little saner since you won't have to explain what various things on the layout are supposed to be all the time. For the 27th time, that is the Limp Bizkit Cracker Company. Signs are everywhere. We're so used to them that we've actually become blind to how many there actually are. And while trying to get a prototypical density of signs will probably overwhelm your scene, not having them immediately makes people feel like something's wrong, even if they can't tell you what. Number 1, pick a different font. One of the simplest ways to make better looking signs is to not rely on the basic fonts on your computer. Don't just fire up the word processor and use what's there. Pick another font. For the love of God, pick a different font. Don't use Arial or Calibri or Times New Roman. Also, don't use typewriter fonts like Courier New. Those don't typically tend to show up on signs. I'm going to call these the basic 4 for the purposes of our discussion today. Finally, please, please, please don't use the worst font of all time, Comic Sans. Just don't. So before we go on, to be technical here for a second, a typeface is a set of design features for letters and other characters, while a font is the variation in weight and size of a typeface. A font family is a group of related fonts. However, the terms are often used interchangeably. We have literally thousands of fonts available to us, so why wouldn't you use them? Your computer even comes preloaded with quite a few. I admit I'm a font junkie. When preparing this video, I checked and I have over 1,000 different font families installed on my computer. You may think that's over the top, but you'd be right. You'd be totally right. But having said that, I checked on my wife Laura's computer. She has just the basic font installations that come with the operating system. And even then, there are 190 fonts on her computer. So there's really no excuse for not using something more interesting than the basic 4 when you're making a sign. With few exceptions, and I'll cover some of those a little later, companies do not use these fonts for their signs. For example, most people have seen a Home Depot. Its signs are instantly recognizable. But does this sign have the same effect? If every home improvement store used a typeface like this, how easy would it be to tell them apart? AutoZone, another quick example. Just how likely would you be to go into the store if their sign looked like this? That font on a sign screams mediocrity. I don't know about you, but I don't want my layout or the signs on it to scream mediocrity. Choose something else. Number 2, mix and match. Another simple way to add interest to your signs without needing much technical know-how is to use multiple fonts in a single sign. Let's talk for a minute about serif and sans serif fonts. You know, I actually heard your eyes glaze over just now. Don't worry, the difference is simple. Serif refers to the little flags that are attached to parts of the letters. In a serif font, like the one on the left, you can see that there are little flag attachments on the letters here, here, and here. In a sans serif font, those just don't appear. Sans serif literally means without a serif. For our purposes, the interplay between the two types can make for interesting signs. If you look at this example sign that I'm making for the fictional Darlington Electronic Instruments, an industry that will soon be going on my shelf layout called the Grunge, you can see I used a sans serif font for the word Darlington and a serif font for the rest. The sans serif font I chose is bold out of the box, so it serves to call attention to the word Darlington. When you have a long company name like this, it's often referred to by shorthand, and in this case, Darlington is a reasonable candidate. So calling attention to it could make sense. Another example I found when I was out taking pictures is the Hub Folding Box Company. They've used a sans serif font for the company name and a serif font for the company slogan. They've also mixed things up a little bit by using all capital letters for the company name and by using initial caps. That is, the first letter of each word is capitalized for the slogan. This serves to call attention to the company name, but also gives you insight into what the company does. Here's an example from my layout. This sign uses large, bolder letters to display the company name and a smaller, plainer font for the welding and industrial supply text. As you can see here, I used it on two sides of the building so that it can be seen from the aisle, as well as from the road if viewed from the layout perspective. I'll make a sheet of these signs in different sizes available on my Patreon page. The link is in the description below. We could use the mix of cases in our Darlington example as well, and as you can see here, it would serve to call attention to the main word even more. Number 3, use different sizes of text. Using different sizes of text, even if you decide to use the same font, can be a great way to add interest to your sign. Typically, but again not always, when you do this, the differing text sizes would be on different lines. Now, why would you want to do this? I can think of a few reasons. Number 1, like in our last example, you may want to call more attention to some of the text over other bits of text. Number 2, you might want to play with spacing. And number 3, you might want to include information that, while important, isn't quite as important as what is in the larger text. Now is probably a great time to point out that these tips don't really live in a vacuum. They build on each other and can be used in different combinations to really punch things up. If we go back to our Darlington example, we could change the size of the text to further emphasize the word Darlington. You can play with the font size and spacing, and it significantly reduces the amount of space needed if you were actually making this sign. You could also revert back to having the second and third words in all caps, which gives a slightly different look, and for me anyway, a different psychological response that I can't quite explain. This also brings us back to the second item I brought up, which is spacing. Changing the font size allows you to match the width of the words so that it gives everything a nice, clean look. You can also play with the spacing in between lines to get the look that you want. For the third example, that is adding information, let's look at this photo I took of the Radford sign. Now, ignoring the logo for a second, you can see that they've used the same font, but at very different sizes. They've also used different cases, and in this case colors, which we'll cover shortly, between the two lines. But by emphasizing the name Radford and then using a much smaller font size to call out warehousing, transportation, and logistics, it forces the eye to naturally focus on the company name first, which you'll definitely want people to remember, then move to the next line, which tells them exactly what the company, which is not a household name, does. Another local example is Check's Finer Foods, which uses a different size not only to set off the main word from the Finer Foods portion, but also emphasizes the C in Check's to give it some additional style. It also uses a different font and font size for the Since 1965 text to set it off so that your eye follows the flow as the designer intended. One last thing I want to mention here about size is utilized by Intest Corporation. For their logo, they use the same typeface and the same text size, but they play with the size concept by significantly bolding Intest, as well as playing with the case of the word to call more attention to that piece. The word corporation, which is likely part of their company's official name, remains part of the signage, but clearly has less emphasis placed on it. Using bold, italics, different case, unusual spacing, and the like is referred to as stylizing, and it's often used to make plain or simple text more interesting. Number 4, use color. Inkjet printers can be tricky when it comes to water slide decals because you have to make sure the ink is completely sealed and so on. But if you're planning to print your signs on paper, cardstock, or even adhesive stock, the use of color and color printing can allow you to become quite creative with your signs. We saw this earlier with the Radford sign. They used a bright, eye-catching red for the company name, then used a much more subdued gray color for the additional information. Similarly, we have Miller Recycling. Again, ignore the logo for a minute. Going back to our discussion about mixing fonts, note in this case that both are sans serif fonts, but they are completely different styles, thicknesses, and colors. The text for Miller Recycling itself is larger and black, while the word corporation uses a thicker, denser font and a much more subtle gray color. This again makes you focus on the Miller Recycling piece, but includes the formal corporation moniker to keep it official. Barrett Distribution Centers uses a similar motif, but instead uses 2 serif fonts, adds color to the main word, adds italics to the rest to provide a flourish of style, and keeps those secondary words all lowercase as well to show that they're subordinate to the main word. If we go back to our Darlington example, I decided to make the main letters a shade of blue. Why? I like blue. Not everything needs a reason. Seriously though, I think the blue color sets the Darlington word off even more than it did before and really emphasizes that piece. Here's an example of a sign I made for an industry on the layout of the club I used to belong to. Full disclosure, this one I did do in a graphics program to get that red oval, but focusing on the font alone, the different font sizes and colors helped project an identity. And as you can see here, I used it not only on the building, but also for a company truck. Coupled with other lettering on the building, it helps give the impression that this company exists beyond the simple confines of the one area of the layout. I'll make a sheet of these signs in all different sizes that can be used for multiple scales, available on my Patreon page as well. If you like it, feel free to use it for your personal use. Number 5, use a logo. Of the tips I'm giving you in this video, this may be the hardest one to achieve using just a word processor, but there are ways to do it. Logos can break up an otherwise plain text string. They can sometimes help give an idea of what the company is about, or in some cases, like the GM logo, replace the text required for the company name entirely. But that usually takes years of marketing and repetition to achieve, which is probably not something you're going to do for a fictional industry on your layout. But hey, your money. If you want to try, go for it. Having said all that, if you look at many logos, they're often simple and often abstract. In other words, it may not take a lot of artistic skill or graphic program know-how to include one in your sign. Let's look again at the Radford logo. It uses an abstract bird. To get something similar, you could use Google to search for abstract bird image and get a lot of different options. Copy the image, paste it into the word processor, and you should be able to move it around near your text to get a look that will work. That's what I did to find a logo for Darlington. I Googled electronic measuring instruments logo image, and among a lot of other things got this dial, which I thought would fit perfectly in the O. I changed the color of part of it in a paint program and dropped it in. No drawing involved. Let's also talk about Amerisource Bergen. To me, their logo looks like an abstraction of a hot air balloon. Your mileage may vary. They're a pharmaceutical distribution company, so I'm not sure what a balloon has to do with that. I am sure that some design firm got paid well to come up with that balloon logo, as well as an ostensible explanation of why it makes sense. But that just makes my point. The logo doesn't have to directly relate to the company's business. While we're talking about AmerisourceBergen, let's look at the font that they use. To me, that looks like Arial. This is one of those exceptions I mentioned earlier. They offset using a very plain font with three things: the logo, the bright blue color, and stylized text. They omit any space or hyphen between the two names. For our purposes, creative combinations of these tips I'm giving you can help you get away with using one of the basic four if you really have to. You should still never use Comic Sans. Seriously, never. Never! If you're making a sign for a layout industry that is actually a real company, again, Google is your friend. You can find most logos on Google or other sites devoted to real company logos. I'll link to a few that I use in the description below. Often, making a sign of these is as simple as copying the image and pasting it into the word processor. Resize the image, you're ready to go. So don't rule out adding a logo to your sign just because you think you're not artistic or technical enough. Number 6, don't get in a rut. This is more of a reminder than anything else. I've given you a lot to work with here, but like anything, I'm looking at you, Weathering. It's also not realistic to have everything look the same. If we look at this set of signs from a shared building in that industrial park I mentioned earlier, you can see that each company's sign has a unique individual look, even though some of those companies are in very similar markets or industries. There's a mixture of fonts, colors, and spacing. Some have logos, some don't. And even though these signs are packed close together, it's easy to pick each company identity out, which wouldn't be the case if there was too much similarity between them. Variety is your friend here. You now have the tools to make better signage. Mix, match, experiment. Play with it until you like it. Run it by other people. See what they think. Make changes if you want. The point is, you have a lot of options and you don't have to stick with the first idea that comes to you. One other reminder, if you're enjoying this video, please click the like button so others know that it's worth their time. So, that is my list of 6 tips to improve your layout signs. I hope that these help you to create some masterpieces for your layout, but I'll settle for signs that aren't just words in the basic 4 fonts. In my next video, I'll do a workshop where we actually go into the software and make signs using these principles. We'll also talk about how you can find fonts and create simple logos, so I hope you'll join me. Make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss it. Also, click on the bell so you'll get notified when it comes out. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Links are in the description below. I'd love to hear about your sign-making experiences, good and bad, in the comments below as well. As always, that is the place for questions and suggestions. Finally, for more great content, check out these links over here. I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll meet me next time in the train room.